Hi everyone, welcome to the Sano Genetics Podcast. I'm Patrick, the host and CEO of Sano. We're here for our second Q&A episode, and this episode is all about interesting stories and facts about DNA and human evolution. So just like the last Q&A episode, which was about myth-busting and direct-to-consumer genetic testing, for this episode we're going to be answering some of the most popular and interesting questions on Quora. So let's go ahead and just get started with the first question. Question number one is, how much DNA do we share with other animals or humans? And this question specifically references the fact that humans and bananas apparently share 50% of their DNA. So this is something that people say a lot. It's not actually true, unfortunately. So what this 50% refers to is just how similar genes between humans and bananas are. We discussed this on the last episode of the podcast, but our genes actually only make up about 2% of the total DNA. So to kind of go through that in more detail, about 2% of our DNA codes for genes, which turns into proteins. About 10 to 20% of DNA is what's called regulatory elements. This is what I studied in my PhD, and that part of the DNA basically controls how the genes are turned on and off. The remaining 80 or 90% actually is probably doing not much of anything. So most of the DNA between humans and bananas is actually very different. But if you just look at the 2% that are genes, there's actually a very high degree of similarity, about 50%. And this is because a lot of our genes are doing something really important. So controlling basic functions of metabolism or how cells divide and grow, which are common to humans and bananas. You may have heard that humans are 99.9% overlapping. This one is actually pretty much true. So the average two people will only be different at about 1 in every 1,000 bases. The only little bit of mistruth to this is that we do have some larger scale differences. So our producer Joe might be missing a chunk of his DNA and I have an extra chunk somewhere else. But if we're looking at just the single base changes, we're about 99.9% similar to other humans, which is pretty interesting. Okay, great. Second question. What are some of the coolest genetic mutations? I had a couple of ideas on this one. One that you might not think of as a mutation, but was a mutation about, I think it's 10 to 12,000 years ago, is the ability to drink milk. So like most mammals, humans originally could only drink their mother's milk for a little while, and maybe until 3 or 4 years of age, but they certainly couldn't drink milk from other species. But at some point that all changed, and a farmer somewhere in Europe, but it's actually happened independently in other parts of the world, acquired a mutation that allowed them to keep drinking milk. And for whatever reason, this allowed them probably to consume more calories, their children to consume more calories, and survive a little bit better, and this mutation swept across the population. But as you might know, a large fraction of people who don't have European ancestry, so people in Asia, for example, are unable to drink milk after a certain point we call lactose intolerance. So today, this doesn't really provide any particular advantage, but at least in Central Europe, 10 to 12,000 years ago, it was a really great mutation to have. Another one that I would nominate as my second place is, and this, there are many people today who experience this, is some mutations affect your ability to feel pain. This is not cool so much as interesting. The inability to feel pain can be a problem because if you get hurt and you don't realize it, then it can become much more serious more quickly. But people who have natural variations in the ability to feel pain may actually help us understand how to design painkillers and other medications to help people who have chronic pain. And then my third and fourth place for coolest mutations were synesthesia and photographic memory. So these are a little more complicated because they're not a single mutation and they're a product of both our genes and our environment. But synesthesia, which is where people have basically senses that overlap. So you hear music and it causes you to see colors, as well as a photographic memory. Both of these are at least in part genetic. Okay, on to our third Quora question, which is related. Really great question. What are the most interesting examples of natural selection in humans? So if you're not familiar, natural selection is the idea that we acquire mutations pretty much randomly, but in some cases those mutations allow us to better adapt to our environment. So as you might expect, people who live in different places in the world might have actually undergone slightly different paths of evolution. And one of the really coolest and most interesting examples I've heard of this actually came out about a year and a half ago. A group of scientists were studying a group of people in Indonesia called the Bajau. And these people can dive underwater up to 70 meters of depth, which if you've ever been scuba diving or snorkeling, this is an incredible depth. Your ears will pop. You'll start to feel the pressure from the ocean on top of you. But these people can do this, and they do it to hunt for food without any kind of scuba gear or anything like that. So the researchers suspected that there might be some kind of genetic adaptation that allowed these people to hold their breath longer and to withstand some of the pressures of diving so deep. And they did find that people who can dive the deepest and are actively engaging in this free scuba diving essentially have mutations that cause their spleens to be a lot larger, which allows them to essentially store and release oxygen while they're underwater. So I thought that was just an amazing study. There are other examples like altitude adaptation in Nepal, for example. People who live very high in the mountains actually have different genes that affect the way they breathe at high altitude. So great question, but my winner is going to go to the deep sea divers. Okay, and our fourth and final question for this episode is another really great one. So on Quora, how many genetic diseases or syndromes exist? I love this question because it's so simple to pose, but the answer is really difficult. So if you ask most genetic scientists, they'll probably say something around 5,000, 6,000, or 7,000. This is a commonly accepted number for the number of genetic conditions. And actually, the vast majority of these conditions are individually rare. So we had an example of this on the podcast a few episodes ago, which was Nick Serow, whose both of his sons have a disorder called alkaptonuria that only happens in 1 in 500,000 people. So in the whole country of the UK, there's just a little over 100 people who have this particular condition. But there are around 5,000 known rare genetic conditions. So while they're individually rare, collectively, they actually affect a huge fraction of the population. So these are the kind of conditions I studied in my PhD, and I think that they're very important to study because generally they're forgotten by the healthcare system, which struggles to produce therapies that might only affect 100 people in a certain country. So that's actually the vast majority of conditions, but a larger number of people are affected by some of the more common conditions like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, breast cancer, Alzheimer's. The interesting thing about this question is that while we have a single name for those conditions, the current understanding of genetics is that actually each of these diseases can be potentially broken down into many different genetically distinct subtypes, and every individual has a different combination of genetics in the environment that actually causes the disease. So what that means is that while two people may have depression, for example, which is in part genetics and also something we talked about on one of the previous podcasts, the way you respond to treatments might be very different depending on what the cause of your depression is. And it's the same case for breast cancer. So there are dozens of different subtypes of breast cancer. So if it comes up in a trivia question, I would say something around 6,000 or 7,000, but just know that as time goes on, this number is almost certainly going to increase. And it may be that eventually we find basically every disorder is different in its own, or every individual, their disorder is different in some way. Okay, that was our last question for this Q&A episode. If you have any follow-up questions, please leave them in the comments section below. If you liked the video, please give us a like using the like button. And then if you want to check out our channel and see other videos that we have lots of other good ones that hopefully you'll enjoy as well. So thanks, and we'll see you next time.